You might manage a world without toilet paper, toothpaste, and regular baths. But what if you had to wash your clothes with urine instead of detergent? Hygiene has always been a bit of a dirty business throughout history. Roman hygiene. Speaking of dirty business, let's see how the Romans managed their hygiene. It's surprising to think that Roman emperors, known for their power and influence, also struggled with being dirty and smelly. Bathing was a big deal in Rome. Public baths, or thermae, were the places to be. They had everything: warm pools, hot pools, cold pools, saunas, and gymnasiums. Emperors like Hadrian loved these baths and often mingled with the public there. Wealthy Romans, of course, could afford private baths with luxuries like marble tubs and bubbling fountains. Now, when it came to keeping clean, Romans didn't use soap. They'd rub oil on their skin and then scrape it off with a tool called a strigil. Moving from personal grooming to laundry practices, things get even more interesting. The Romans used urine, which contains ammonia, to clean their clothes. Traders collected urine from public toilets and sold it to fillers for laundry. This practice was so widespread that Emperor Vespasian even taxed urine, famously telling his son Titus that money doesn't smell, even if it comes from urine. Medieval hygiene. Just when you thought things couldn't get any stranger, let's leap forward in time to the medieval era. Hygiene practices were rougher and smellier, adding a new layer of grime to everyday life. Back in the Middle Ages, bathing wasn't exactly a daily habit. Commoners usually started their day by washing their hands and faces, but full body baths were rare. Unlike the rich who enjoyed private tubs, everyone else made do with public baths or a quick dip in the local stream. Public baths were a bit of a double-edged sword. While they provided a place to get clean, they were also hotspots for spreading diseases, especially during the plague. Speaking of the plague, desperate times called for desperate measures. People believed that bathing in vinegar and rosewater would ward off the Black Death. Some even bathed in their own urine, thinking it had healing properties. Imagine the smell! Medieval soap was made from ashes and animal fat, a labor-intensive process. It wasn't just about staying clean. It was about survival. If you didn't know how to make your own soap, you were in for some very dirty times. Interestingly, some communities fared better during these times due to stricter hygiene practices. Jewish communities often had lower infection rates during the plague, thanks to their stricter hygiene practices. Instead of learning from their healthier neighbors, some Christians blamed the Jews for the plague, accusing them of poisoning wells. This led to horrific acts of violence and persecution, despite the fact that many Jewish hygiene practices were simply better at preventing disease. Doctors in the Middle Ages also had some unusual ideas about treating the plague. Medieval doctors believed in drawing the plague out of the body by cutting open buboes and draining pus. They applied mixtures of plant roots, resin, and dried feces, yes, dried feces, to wounds, and some even recommended drinking the pus to heal. Handling human waste was another major issue during this period. Townsfolk often shared one toilet among dozens of households. Heavy rains could cause cesspits to overflow, sending human waste into the streets and contaminating water supplies. Some people couldn't even be bothered to walk to the cesspit, so they emptied their chamber pots directly into the street. Gross, right? To protect themselves, plague doctors adopted unique costumes. It was a beaked mask stuffed with herbs and spices, and was designed to protect against these miasmas. The outfit was the most medieval equivalent of a hazmat suit, keeping the doctors safe from what they thought was bad air, but was actually more about contact with the infected. Victorian hygiene. Fast forward to the Victorian era, where things got even more peculiar. Hygiene habits were a curious mix of emerging practices and bizarre beliefs. During the Victorian era, many people thought taking a hot bath was bad for your health. They believed it weakened the body and opened pores, allowing diseases to enter. So, instead of soaking in hot water, Victorians preferred a quick wash. For example, King Louis XIV of France only took 2 baths in his entire life. Instead, he wiped himself down with a towel, used perfume and alcohol, and washed his hands every morning. Not exactly the cleanest routine. Perfumes played a significant role in Victorian hygiene. With limited access to regular baths, people relied heavily on perfumes to mask their body odors. At places like Versailles, the air was thick with various scents, trying to cover the smell of unwashed bodies. Public restrooms were another area of concern. Public restrooms were neither private nor clean. At places like Versailles, people often relieved themselves in hallways or gardens, and chamber pots were emptied into the streets below. Dental care also posed challenges during this time. Toothbrushes were a luxury. So many used twigs or rags and homemade toothpaste made from chalk, soot, or powdered cuttlefish. Tooth extractions were commonly done by barbers or blacksmiths. Laundry practices were the same as medieval and Roman times, soaking clothes in ammonia. Urine. Disgusting, right? Feminine hygiene saw some progress slowly with the invention of disposable pads and early versions of tampons. However, these products took time to become widely accepted, and women often had to get creative with their hygiene solutions. In 1858, the Great Stink of the River Thames nearly shut down London, highlighting the urgent need for better sanitation. Tuberculosis was a major health concern, and some doctors bizarrely blamed it on women's clothing. They thought long skirts dragged along the streets, picking up germs and spreading the disease to families. Tight corsets were also blamed for constricting the lungs and contributing to tuberculosis. These beliefs led to recommendations for looser corsets and shorter skirts, seen as more hygienic. Victorian hygiene marked the beginning of modern hygiene practices, from the use of perfumes to cover up odors to the early versions of tampons and disposable pads. The Victorians started to understand the importance of cleanliness, even if they didn't always get it right. Hygiene in the Civil War. And now, let's march into the Civil War, where hygiene was a constant battle against dirt, disease, and poor conditions. Soldiers faced harsh conditions that made staying clean nearly impossible. When men enlisted, they underwent medical exams to check if they were fit for service. But these exams were pretty basic, focusing on whether they could march, carry a rifle, and follow orders. Many men with poor hygiene habits slipped through the cracks. Surprisingly, at least 400 women disguised themselves as men and successfully enlisted, highlighting how lax these medical checks were. Camps were breeding grounds for diseases. Soldiers from different parts of the country brought various childhood diseases with them, like chickenpox, measles, and mumps. Those who hadn't been exposed to these diseases before quickly fell ill. Vaccination programs helped reduce the spread of smallpox, but other diseases like typhus, malaria, and dysentery were rampant. Sanitary conditions in the camps were dreadful. Makeshift latrines, known as sinks, were little more than open ditches. Often, these latrines were placed near areas where soldiers slept or ate, contaminating their living space. Sometimes, soldiers would dig latrines too close to water sources, contaminating their drinking water. This led to outbreaks of cholera and other diseases spread through dirty water. One major issue was the lack of clean clothes. Soldiers often shared uniforms, which were rarely washed. This sharing spread lice and other pests, leading to diseases like typhus. Lice were so common that soldiers even made a game out of racing them on custom tracks. Medical treatments were crude and dangerous, with reused tools and poor hygiene spreading infections. For example, sponges covered in blood and pus were sometimes rinsed briefly before being reused, further spreading infection. Amputation was a common procedure for wounded soldiers. Surgeons lacking proper sanitation often performed these operations quickly and with minimal anesthesia, usually chloroform or ether. Over 60,000 amputations were performed during the war. Piles of severed limbs became a common sight near battlefield hospitals, posing a significant health hazard. Some limbs were buried in pits, but many were left exposed, attracting pests and spreading disease. Malaria and pneumonia claimed many lives, with over 10,000 soldiers dying from malaria and 20,000 from pneumonia. Dysentery and diarrhea were common due to contaminated water and a poor diet. The U.S. Sanitary Commission inspected Union camps and hospitals, providing guidelines for better hygiene. Their efforts improved conditions slightly, but many soldiers still suffered from poor sanitary practices. So there you have it, guys. If you enjoyed this video, YouTube thinks you'll like the next one too. Click on it to continue watching.